If you enjoy listening to blues music and you've also got a nice set of speakers or headphones set up, you might have at times lamented some of the recording quality that's out there and around. Of course, some of that's because blues recordings are really old, but other times it's just that they're crunchy and overcompressed and not that enjoyable. So I've gone scouring the internet for you to try to find what I think are 5 of the best recorded and also enjoyable blues albums you can listen to as an audiophile. I'd like to start off by sending out 2 sets of thanks here, and the first is to those of you that have shared your thoughts, shared your feedback, and shared your ideas on how I can continue to improve and evolve this tune-up series. For those of you that are new to these videos, this tune-up series is a series of videos where I go out there and try to find music that I think you might also enjoy. I've got a full playlist of tune-up videos, so you can check that out on the Passion for Sound channel page here on YouTube. But this one's going to be quite different to other episodes, and that's thanks to viewer feedback. I'm sorry, I don't remember who made the specific comment suggesting this, but you'll know who you are. Thank you so much for the suggestion. This video is my top 5 recommended audiophile blues albums. I began this after much research and some quick listening with a short list of 9 albums. And so from there I had to whittle it down, remove 4 of them, and come up with my final 5. Before I share with you what those 9 shortlisted albums were, and then what the final 5 are, the other thing I wanted to say was a huge thanks once again to channel sponsor Linsol. Linsol is an online retailer of DACs, amps, headphones, in-ear monitors, all sorts of different gear, and they've been kind enough to sponsor Passion for Sound and make it possible for me to do videos like this one that maybe aren't quite as popular, don't generate much revenue, but it's a topic and a content that I really want to share with you, and Linsol have made it possible. So thank you to Linsol. If you're interested in checking them out and saying thank you to making this series possible, then check out the link down in the description below and see if there's any gear that you might like to buy from them. And now with all the thanks out of the way, let's start talking about my short list of the top 9 blues albums that I first considered, and then how I whittled them down to my top 5. In just the alphabetical order of the album titles, the albums that I shortlisted are the following. We had Alone and Acoustic by Buddy Guy and Junior Wells, Blue and Lonesome by the Rolling Stones, The Blues Singer by Buddy Guy, Folk Singer by Muddy Waters, The Healer by John Lee Hooker, Hoodoo Man Blues by Junior Wells, In My Soul by Robert Cray, although I could also have chosen Should Have Been Home and or Take Your Shoes Off. They're all fantastic sounding albums. And then also Jail by Big Mama Thornton and Live in Cook County Jail by B.B. King. And so that was my starting list. They're 9 fantastic sounding albums. You can make it up to 11 if you want to include those other 2 Robert Cray Band albums. And so the first step was to listen to those and see which ones I could whittle out to find my top 5. What I focused on when choosing these was a combination of multiple factors, including things like how well the soundstage was presented and the location of instruments in that soundstage. Obviously, the sense of pure fidelity or clarity in the recording is important too. And then finally, the tonality of the recording. A couple of albums sounded really nicely recorded with great soundstage, but as I listened, I felt like the actual mix wasn't entirely as balanced tonally as I'd like it to be. It's not to say they're bad recordings, but they just fell short of some of the others that I think are absolutely fantastic. A couple of the notable cuts where there was a specific reason that I chose to pull it out, rather than it being just maybe not quite as good as one of the others. There were 2 albums that I specifically cut for 2 different reasons. First of all, with Alone and Acoustic, which was the Buddy Guy and Junior Wells album. The reason I cut that one was it really confused me when, as I listened to it, Buddy Guy was playing both guitar and singing, but his guitar was coming out of the left channel and his vocal out of the right, and it just didn't make sense in my brain. Now obviously if you listen to this album and you completely forget that it's the same person playing guitar and singing, then you don't have to worry about it. But for me, it kept messing with my brain that I knew that he was doing both and they should have sounded like they were coming from roughly the same place. Ideally vocal a little bit above where the guitar was coming from, but that's not the case on that album. In all other ways, it's a great album. I do recommend checking it out, but it's not in my top 5. Another notable cut for me was The Healer by John Lee Hooker. It's a fantastic recording, everything sounds brilliant on it, but musically it's probably less inspiring, less engaging than some of the others. So it got cut for that reason. And so now, without any further ado, let's get into my top 5 blues albums for audiophiles. Once again, I'm going to approach this list alphabetically, rather than trying to order them in terms of best to worst recording. They're all fantastic. And we're going to start off, therefore, with Blue and Lonesome by the Rolling Stones. This is a 2016 album, and it was produced by Don Was, or Was, I'm not sure. He was one of the founders of the band Was Not Was, or Was Not Was Not Was, I'm not quite sure. But he was the founder of that, and it was also interesting because this was actually recorded in Mark Knopfler's London studios. And the story behind this album is that apparently the Rolling Stones sat up in the studio to record an album, and to get warmed up they decided to play a blues standard. I can't recall which track it was. But they enjoyed that process so much, it felt so good, perhaps it sounded so good, I forget the details of the story. But the end result was they decided to carry on and continue recording a whole lot of blues, kind of standards, a true blues album if you like. Now I should mention that I did nearly cut this album from the top 5 because Mick Jagger's vocals, there's a lot of distortion applied to them. A couple of the tracks I feel like there's a bit of excess reverb being used. It almost creates that old school bathroom effect where they used to record vocals in bathrooms to create reverb. I didn't necessarily like that, but it's undeniable how well everything is mixed and mastered on this album. There's a great sense of rhythm and drive from the rest of the band, and despite the extra distortion and reverb applied to Mick Jagger's vocals, everything still does sound good. It just wasn't quite as pristine as some of the other albums, and that's what brought it close to the edge, but it was undeniably a fantastic listen. Moving on to the second album in the list, and this is Blues Singer by Buddy Guy. This is a 2003 album produced by Dennis Herring, and Dennis Herring is a 2-time Grammy Award winner. He's worked with bands like the Counting Crows and also Elvis Costello, and this album also features appearances by B.B. King, Eric Clapton and Jim Keltner. It's largely an acoustic album with just Buddy Guy, his guitar and his vocals, but as I've already mentioned, there are some guest musicians that come in and provide accompaniment, so you get quite a nice range of more stripped back, simple blues playing of just the guitar and the vocal, but then you also get a little bit of, I wouldn't call it high energy blues, but with some accompaniment, with some extra kind of meat to the bones. One of the reasons I chose this album is there's a wonderful sense of clarity and accuracy and sort of transparency, you could say, in the recording. All the instrumentation sounds fantastic, sounds beautifully separated, very well rendered in the mix. And so this one's not quite as raucous as something like Blue and Lonesome by the Rolling Stones. It gives a nice contrast and another wonderful recording. And so let's move on now to the third album in the list, and that's Folk Singer by Muddy Waters. I think anyone that's been around the Audiophiles scene and ever looked for good sounding albums, Muddy Waters' Folk Singer has probably come up on the list. This is a 1963 recording. It does sound like an old recording, but what makes this special was that this was a recording of a group of fantastic blues musicians in a single room, a well-treated room, just recorded doing their thing. So it's got that feel of almost a live recording without some of the drawbacks of live recordings. This album was produced by Willie Dixon, who's one of the musicians on the album, and also Phil Chess, who's one of the Chess brothers that founded Chess Records. And it coincidentally features Buddy Guy on guitar. And I noticed as I went through this that Buddy Guy has got such a strong representation through some of the very best recordings in blues history. I don't know if that's by coincidence or if he chooses the people he works with very well, but either way, Buddy Guy popped up time and time again in all these wonderful recordings. Folk Singer represents another example of really kind of stripped back, simple blues music. At times it's got just a little bit more energy than what you hear on Blues Singer, but overall they're quite similar albums in terms of the content, the style, that kind of stripped back, simple, raw but polished nature. One of the things that makes Folk Singer such a great album for listening to is the placement of all the individual sounds is fantastic. There's a very natural sense of staging because it was all recorded live in a single space, but without any of the disruptions, as I said before, of a live recording with an audience in a venue that might be imperfect acoustically. This was in a studio that's very well treated, but otherwise pretty much a live recording. I mentioned before it's an old recording having been produced in 1963, and what that means is that there is a slight sense of a sort of higher noise floor. It's not the blackest background you'll hear in a recording. But having said that, the sense of fidelity, clarity, and quality overall is still excellent. So it hasn't got quite the cleanliness and the polish of a more modern recording like Blues Singer, but it's still no doubt an exceptional audiophile album and great blues as well. On to the second last album now, and again reminding you this is just alphabetical order. This is not about best to worst or worst to best. But the next album alphabetically is In My Soul by Robert Cray or the Robert Cray Band. They go under both names at times. This is a 2014 album and was produced by Steve Jordan. Now, Steve Jordan is also the drummer on this album. He's also the drummer for a lot of John Mayer albums, including the John Mayer Trio. He's a very well-regarded drummer and seemingly an excellent producer as well. In My Soul is a bit of a crossover album in some ways where it's a little bit soul, it's a little bit blues. But being from Robert Cray Band, it's definitely got a good solid infusion of blues guitar and that blues feel that Robert Cray's got. The recording and the mixing and mastering is very clean. There's lots of space around the instruments. So you can pick out each individual sound very clearly, but it still produces a wonderful coherent sense of the band overall. This is a less grimy, gritty or raw album than some of the others in my list here, but it's no less enjoyable for it. Unlike what I said about The Healer by John Lee Hooker, where some of the music feels a bit less inspired, I definitely feel like there's emotion and care and a sort of soul, I guess you could say, in the music on In My Soul. And so it's a great album to listen to. There's some wonderful tracks. It's just cleaner and more polished and refined than some of the other albums here. And that brings me around now to the final album on the list, again just alphabetically, and it's Live in Cook County Jail by B.B. King. Now I did consider 2 different live albums from B.B. King for this list. The other one was Live at the Regal. And by all accounts, people tend to think that Live at the Regal is maybe the better performance. It's maybe the more exciting listen. But I definitely feel like Live in Cook County Jail is the better recording. So if you want to balance those two, Live in Cook County Jail is a wonderful performance and also a fantastic recording. Live at the Regal is probably just a little bit behind on the recording, but still an amazing, amazing listen. Live in Cook County Jail was recorded in 1971 and produced by, I'm going to get this wrong probably, Bill Shimchick, I'm not quite sure. Let me know in the comments if you know how to pronounce that name. And interestingly enough, Bill Shimchick, and I'm just going to go with that even though it's probably wrong, I'm sorry about that. Bill Shimchick is an ex-US Navy sonar operator, which is a really interesting path going from being a sonar operator into being a producer. More often it's people that have gone entirely into production or they've gone into being a musician and learning about production along the way, but he was a sonar operator originally that then moved into production. He's also worked with the Eagles, produced some of their fantastic albums, so we know he knows what he's doing because the Eagles stuff is almost always very well put together. As you listen to Live in Cook County Jail, what I'd say about it is that it's wonderful in the sense that it is a live recording, but it does have some drawbacks. I feel like B.B. King's vocals, his guitar solos are really sort of present, well-centered. There's a lovely sense of space in the mix and where each instrument's placed. But one thing worth being aware of is that I feel like the backing instrumentals are just a little bit distant. They're a little bit kind of pulled back in the mix overall. And I mean that both in terms of their physical position seems a little bit further away from B.B. King than is probably natural. And also what I feel like is that you get this sense that the tonality is a little bit different on them. It's not a big deal and it's not a reason to cut this out of the top 5 list. I still think it deserves a place here. But I think it's probably not the strongest in terms of the tonality overall, and where its strength lies is the quality of the performance, the quality of the music, and also the sense of space and ambience produced. On top of that, you do get to focus really tightly on B.B. King's incredible musicianship, and so that's really what got it into the top 5 over some of those others. And so I hope you've enjoyed this list of my top 5, and indeed the top 9 if you want to look at the shortlist as well, or even top 11. Let me know in the comments below which is your favourite from the top 5 or the top 11, and are there any other blues albums that you'd recommend for others to check out? As always, I hope you found this video useful, interesting. Hopefully I've introduced you to some new musicians or new albums that you didn't know before. And if you have enjoyed the video, I'd love it as always if you'd hit the like button and consider subscribing and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. But for now, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.